June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots believed they were diving toward helpless ships. Their radar warned of nothing. The ocean below looked calm, unguarded. Then, without a single tracer fired, the air around them began to explode. Invisible shells burst in perfect rings, detonating before a bullet could be seen. Wings tore apart. Engines vanished in fire. To the pilots, it felt as if the sky itself had turned against them, as if the air had learned to shoot back. They called it witchcraft. American gunners called it the new proximity fuse, a device that could sense an aircraft's presence and detonate at the exact instant of danger. By noon, hundreds of Japanese planes had fallen into the sea. What began as a proud strike became a massacre history would remember by another name: the Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the spring of 1944, the Pacific War reached a hinge point. For more than 2 years, the United States Navy had advanced island by island across the Central Pacific, pushing Japan's defensive ring ever closer to its homeland. The next step, an operation called Forager, targeted the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From those volcanic ridges, long-range B-29 bombers could finally reach Tokyo itself. To Japan's admirals, the loss of the Marianas would mean the loss of the war. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, responded with a plan named Operation Eigo. It was built on the old doctrine of Kantai Kessen, one decisive battle that would destroy the American fleet in a single stroke. Toyoda ordered Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to lure the U.S. carriers into range of land-based aircraft stationed across the Philippines and the Marianas. When the Americans came, Japan's carriers would strike first, using longer-range planes to keep their ships safely beyond retaliation. The idea looked elegant on paper, but by 1944 Japan no longer possessed the air crews to make it work. Hundreds of its best naval aviators had been lost at Midway and over the Solomon Islands. Their replacements were brave but scarcely trained. Many had never landed on a carrier deck at night or fought above open ocean. Fuel shortages limited practice flights. Engine parts were scavenged from wrecks. Still, Tokyo promised a victory that would restore the empire's fading pride. Across the ocean, Admiral Chester Nimitz's Fifth Fleet gathered for Forager. Under his overall command, Admiral Raymond Spruance would protect the invasion, while Admiral Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58, the most powerful carrier group ever assembled, would control the skies. 14 carriers, nearly 900 aircraft, and a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers formed a single moving fortress. Each carrier housed a new kind of brain, the Combat Information Center, where radar scopes replaced binoculars and mathematicians replaced lookouts. When the invasion of Saipan began on June 15th, Japan's commanders finally moved. Ozawa's mobile fleet, 9 carriers with more than 400 aircraft, sailed from the Sulu Sea toward the Marianas. Both sides knew a decisive clash was coming, but only one side truly understood how modern the next war had become. By the eve of June 18, 1944, the largest carrier armadas ever to face each other were closing in from opposite ends of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet advanced from the west, 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and dozens of escorts. He planned to strike from beyond visual range, relying on aircraft with longer reach than the Americans. If the opening wave succeeded, he would finish the survivors in a classic surface engagement. It was the last attempt to fight the kind of battle the Imperial Navy had been dreaming of since Tsushima in 1905. To the east, Admiral Spruance kept his formation tight, protecting the transport's landing Marines on Saipan. Task Force 58 spread into 4 task groups, each built around heavy and light carriers. Their decks held the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, rugged, fast, and forgiving, and the new Helldiver bombers that could dive from 20,000 feet and hit a ship's deck with mathematical precision. But their greatest weapon wasn't in the air. It was hidden in the coordination below. Every carrier in Task Force 58 was wired into an expanding web of electronics: radar antennas that swept the horizon, communication circuits that connected fighter direction centers, and a central combat information center. A dim, windowless room where sailors plotted the world in green light. Here, watch officers and mathematicians calculated the altitude, speed, and direction of every contact. Pilots flying combat air patrol could be guided to an interception point within seconds. It was warfare conducted by geometry and timing rather than luck or eyesight. Even the defensive guns had changed. The big 5-inch mounts no longer relied solely on human reflexes. They fired shells fitted with a proximity fuse, a small radio sensor that detonated when it neared an aircraft. Instead of tracing a visible path, these shells burst invisibly in midair, creating spheres of shrapnel that seemed to predict an enemy's movement. To Japanese pilots, it would look like the sky itself was firing back. As darkness fell, American submarines trailing Ozawa's fleet reported heavy activity. The carriers Taihō and Shōkaku were at sea. At dawn, Ozawa would launch the first blow. He believed his aircraft would find an exposed invasion force. What they would find instead was an ocean wired for their destruction. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a clash of pilots. It was the first time in history that a fleet fought through mathematics. Deep inside each carrier, the Combat Information Center, known to the crews simply as CIC, became the brain of the operation. Here, men who never saw the sky controlled the flow of an entire war. They listened to radar bearings, called out angels for altitude, and placed transparent markers on plotting tables. It was quiet work, the kind of silence that carried weight. Each voice spoke with precision: distance, course, climb rate. When a blip changed speed, they knew it wasn't a weather echo, it was an attack. Above deck, fighter direction officers turned those numbers into movement. They drew invisible lines through the air, vectoring groups of Hellcats toward precise intercept points. The timing had to be exact. Send them too soon, and they would run out of fuel. Too late, and the fleet would face the bombers alone. Every interception became a chess move calculated at 150 knots. The result was a defense that felt less like improvisation and more like a living algorithm. The gunners on deck trusted their own machine, one they didn't entirely understand. The new proximity fuse had arrived only months earlier, developed in secrecy and guarded as one of the Allies' most valuable weapons. Each small shell contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. When it sensed the metal of an approaching aircraft, it detonated automatically. The margin of error dropped from yards to inches. For the first time, anti-aircraft fire no longer needed to hit its target. It only needed to be near. Japanese pilots who dove toward American carriers saw no tracer lines to dodge. Instead, the air itself erupted in mid-flight, flashes with no visible source. They tried to climb, to twist, to dive lower, but the explosions followed like echoes. Later, survivors said it felt as if the atmosphere itself had turned hostile. They weren't far from the truth. The sky above the Marianas had become a weapon all its own. For all its precision, the American defense still depended on men who could think as quickly as their instruments. The average U.S. Navy pilot in 1944 had more than 300 flight hours before reaching combat. They had practiced carrier landings in full gear, learned to trust the instruments in cloud and night, and drilled on formation tactics until reaction became instinct. Their aircraft, the Grumman Hellcat, was built to forgive error. It could take hits, dive, and climb without stalling. It was the ideal partner for a pilot trained not to fear it. Across the ocean, Japan's pilots faced a different reality. The Empire's training pipeline had collapsed under the strain of attrition and fuel shortage. Many of the airmen Ozawa brought to the Philippine Sea had logged fewer than 100 flight hours. Some had never fired their guns in practice. What Japan sent into battle that morning was not an air force. It was a generation of students armed with courage, but little experience. They flew machines that were lighter, faster in a turn, but fatally fragile. One burst of proximity-fused shrapnel could shear a wing from its roots. The difference extended beyond the cockpits. It reached into the heart of command. On American carriers, damage control teams trained as rigorously as the pilots. Every sailor learned how to seal bulkheads, flood fuel lines, and smother electrical fires. The ship was a living organism. Survival depended on reflex. In the Imperial Navy, that culture barely existed. Pride valued aggression over endurance. When the carrier Taihō was torpedoed that morning, its captain opened the ventilation system to clear fumes, a fatal mistake that spread explosive vapors throughout the ship. Hours later, the flagship disintegrated in a single flash. Japan's most modern carrier was gone because its crew followed instinct instead of procedure. Meanwhile, inside Ozawa's command rooms, the battle looked deceptively promising. Faulty radio reports claimed American carriers were burning, Hellcats falling in droves. In truth, what the Japanese believed were victories were explosions of their own aircraft. Radar and proximity fuses had confused even their perception of reality. The enemy they thought they were destroying had barely been touched. At dawn on June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea lay still as polished glass. On the decks of 14 American carriers, flight crews checked their aircraft while loudspeakers murmured the routine morning call. Flight quarters. Below deck, the combat information centers were already alive. Radar scopes lit up with echoes moving from the west. Small at first, then multiplying until the screens looked like swarms of insects. The range was 150 miles. Bearing confirmed, the enemy was coming. At 8:30 in the morning, the first Japanese strike, roughly 70 planes, rose above the horizon. They had been launched from Ozawa's forward carriers hundreds of miles away. Fighter director officers in the American fleet began reading coordinates aloud. Raid 1, Angels 20, closing at 250 knots. Hellcat squadrons detached from their holding patterns and climbed into interception arcs. Within minutes, blue shapes filled the high morning sky, forming invisible walls. The Japanese flew directly into them. The battle unfolded in layers. The outer screen of Hellcats engaged first, tearing apart the bombers before they reached gun range. Those who broke through met a second ring of fighters orbiting the battleships. Beyond them waited the invisible barrier of anti-aircraft fire. 5-inch guns guided by radar and loaded with proximity-fused shells. The fuses triggered in bursts of white light, detonating within yards of their targets. To the Japanese, it looked as though the sky itself had turned sentient. Planes vanished mid-roll. Others disintegrated before reaching their dive angles. Only a handful broke through to the main formation. A single bomb struck the battleship South Dakota, killing 27 men but leaving the ship operational. By 10 in the morning, the first wave was annihilated. 42 of the 70 attackers were gone. The second wave came soon after, larger and better coordinated, but it faced an enemy that had already measured its rhythm. Once again, radar picked them up far beyond sight. Fighters rose, guns prepared, calculations repeated. When the last fragments of that formation fell smoking into the sea, the count was nearly 100 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of a handful of Americans. The crews aboard the U.S. carriers began calling it the Turkey Shoot. To those inside the radar rooms, it felt like something deeper, the confirmation that a machine could outthink the human will. As the first waves of burning aircraft fell away, unseen hunters below the surface prepared their own ambush. The American submarines Albacore and Kavala had been trailing Ozawa's task force for hours, reporting its movements by encrypted bursts. Shortly after 10 in the morning, Albacore sighted a massive carrier moving east. It was Taihō, the pride of Japan's fleet, brand new and armored. The submarine fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One struck. The carrier shuddered but stayed afloat. Believing the damage minor, her captain continued launching aircraft. In the hangars below, gasoline fumes began to collect. By midday, Kavala had found another target. Shōkaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. 3 torpedoes struck in rapid succession. The explosions ripped open her fuel tanks, and within minutes the great ship vanished beneath a column of smoke. At 1:20 in the afternoon, Taihō's luck ended as well. A spark from an electric motor ignited the vapor building inside her hull. The blast tore the ship apart, killing over 1,000 men. 2 of Japan's most powerful carriers were gone, victims not of bombs or shells, but of a failure to understand chemistry and procedure. That evening, Ozawa's surviving carriers attempted to regroup. He still believed his strikes had crippled the Americans. His pilots, those few who returned, claimed dozens of kills. But their sightings were illusions. What they had seen burning were their own aircraft detonating in proximity bursts. Ozawa sent messages to Tokyo announcing victory, unaware that his air arm had ceased to exist. On the American side, Admiral Mitscher prepared the counterstroke. By 4 in the afternoon, reconnaissance aircraft had finally located Ozawa's retreating force, nearly 300 miles away, beyond safe range for a carrier strike. Mitscher launched anyway. 226 aircraft thundered off his decks, flying into the setting sun with fuel enough for one-way travel. They reached the enemy at dusk, crippling another carrier and sinking 2 oilers. Then came the true test, returning through darkness with empty tanks. At 9:30 that night, seeing pilots crashing into the sea while searching for home, Mitscher made a decision no admiral had dared before. He ordered every ship in Task Force 58 to turn on its lights. Decks blazed white across the ocean, a beacon visible for miles, an open invitation to any lurking submarine. The risk saved hundreds of men. The fleet had fought with machines all day. That night it remembered it was human. By dawn on June 20, 1944, the Philippine Sea was quiet again. Oil slicks spread across the water, dotted with the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft. The smell of fuel and salt hung like a haze. American destroyers still circled, picking up pilots who had run out of fuel during the night return. They called it Mitscher's Lights, the night when the U.S. Navy turned the Pacific into a single glowing runway. The numbers told the story better than any headline. Japan had launched roughly 400 aircraft into battle. By the end of the second day, more than 315 were gone. 42 of those were carrier-trained pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had once fought at Pearl Harbor and Midway. Only a few dozen aircraft limped back to their decks. When Ozawa finally counted what remained, he had just 35 operational planes across 9 carriers. The Americans lost 29 aircraft in air combat and about 80 more to fuel exhaustion and crash landings. Tragic but sustainable losses for a fleet that could replace its planes within weeks. Japan could not replace anything. Its training schools were empty, its fuel reserves nearly gone, its carriers now hollow shells with flight decks but no wings. News of the disaster reached Tokyo in fragments. Radio Tokyo announced a grand victory, claiming 11 American carriers sunk. In truth, not a single U.S. warship had been destroyed. The illusion of parity between the two navies had vanished. The Japanese naval air arm, once the most feared in the Pacific, had effectively ceased to exist. In the weeks that followed, the Marianas turned from battlefields into fortresses. American engineers landed on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, carving runways across the coral. Within months, the first B-29 superfortresses were taking off for missions Japan had believed impossible, direct raids on its homeland. The ocean that once protected the empire had become a runway pointed straight at Tokyo. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the results, wrote in his report that the Japanese Navy as a decisive instrument of war has ceased to exist. He was not exaggerating. Every Japanese carrier that survived the battle would later sail without trained pilots to fly from them. When they appeared again, at Leyte Gulf 4 months later, they were decoys, floating traps meant to die for distraction. For the United States, the victory confirmed something new. Naval air power had matured into a system that could defend itself, find its own targets, and strike without land support. The combination of radar, coordination centers, and technology like the proximity fuse had created what the Navy quietly called the kill web, a network that could see farther, shoot faster, and think ahead of any human eye. What began as defense now defined a doctrine: dominance through information. By the summer's end, Japan's remaining admirals spoke of the air graveyard of the Marianas. They were not wrong. Beneath those waters lay the remains of an entire generation of pilots, and the last breath of an empire's air power. In every war, there comes a day when courage no longer decides the outcome. On the 19th of June, 1944, that day arrived for Japan's air arm. Bravery met mathematics, instinct met radar, and the men who had once ruled the Pacific skies faced an enemy they could neither see nor outfly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not end with burning cities or captured islands. It ended in silence, the kind that follows the fall of something greater than ships. The old era of naval warfare, where men looked through gun sights and shouted over the roar of engines, was gone. In its place stood a new kind of battlefield, one measured in frequencies, range gates, and invisible signals. The machines had learned to think faster than the pilots who once defied them. Yet for all its precision, the victory remained deeply human. The sailors who turned on their lights that night, risking submarines and death to save their comrades, proved that technology alone could not define a fleet. What held them together was not the radar beam or the fuse circuit, but something older and immeasurable: trust. When historians later called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the name carried both triumph and tragedy. It was the end of Japan's carrier power, but also the moment the Pacific War crossed a threshold it would never return from. Within a year, bombers from those same islands would set cities ablaze with firestorms no ocean could contain. The sky had changed, and with it, the nature of war itself. In the blue calm that followed, the Philippine Sea looked no different from before. But beneath its surface rested the proof that the future of warfare had already arrived: silent, invisible, and absolute.